Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to talk to you about how to separate tuberous perennial plants and bulbous perennial plants. So both of them are quite similar, they just have slightly different ways of growing, and I'll talk about that later on in the video. So basically you wanted to get this done at the right time of year. The plant needs to be dormant. Now it can vary with plant to plant. Generally if it's spring bulbs that will be the middle of summer, but most other tuberous or bulbous perennial plants that will tend to be winter time. Basically, whenever the plant has no leaves on it, that should be a time when it's dormant. The only exception would be probably spring bulbs, which over winter and autumn tend to grow their roots. So although they look dormant because there's no leaves on the top half, they are actually still actively growing underground. So you just need to check for your variety of plant. The one I'm digging up here is Rhizomatous. It's a type of calla lily, and this tends to be dormant in my part of the world in the winter months at its coldest. If you're in a hot, dry climate though, you might find it's dormant in the summertime. But basically whenever it goes dormant, that's a good time to transplant the plant. It's going to have less shock. When it doesn't have leaves and it's actually growing, all the energy is stored up in the bulbs or the tubers, and it's going to transplant a lot better. So the first thing you want to do is cut back any excess dead material. I've already done this on this plant, but you want to keep a little bit of the stem if you can, just so you know where the plant is and it makes it easier to separate later. But don't worry too much if that's not possible. And so what you need to do first of all is to dig it up and separate the individual bulbs. Now it depends on the tuberous plants. Some of them they tend to separate naturally, other ones you need to break them apart. So it just depends on the variety. And when it comes to digging it up, you don't have to dig it around it as much space as you would if you were just transplanting a normal plant with roots, because the tubers tend to be a lot more compact, they don't spread as far as the roots. But you still want to make sure you dig far enough away that you don't slice through the tubers, because the tubers can quite often come out further than the actual base of the plant. This plant, for example, I don't want to be digging right next to it here. I want to be a little bit out by probably about 10-15 centimeters. Make sure I miss any of the tubers or bulbs that might be coming out further from the plant. So I'm just going to go ahead now, dig this out, and then I can talk about how to separate it and look after the plants once you've separated them. So once you've pulled up the plant from the ground like this, what you want to start doing is start chipping away at the soil, just carefully not to damage any of the roots. You want to take off as much soil as possible so you can get back to where the actual bulbs or tubers are, and then you have a much smaller, more manageable size of plant to deal with. And in this process, don't worry about cutting off any of the roots. The tubers and bulbs will regrow their roots, so it's not any damage to the plant really if you take off the roots. It does depend how thick the roots are. Some plants that have tubers rather than rhizomes or bulbs will have quite thick fleshy roots, and you want to keep them. But any small roots, don't worry about cutting them off. The plant will be absolutely fine. It's the thick tuberous roots that store the energy, and they're the ones you want to keep. Or if you have bulbs and corms, it's also them. They're the part you want to make sure you don't damage. So when you get to this stage where you're very close to the actual tubers or bulbs, what you want to do is then stop using a spade. You want to be a lot more careful. You don't want to risk damaging those sections of the plant. So what I'm going to do now is switch to either using just my gloves or a trowel, something a bit more delicate. Another thing you can do, depending on your soil type, is you can just get a hose and wash all the soil off. That'll make it a lot easier to see what you're doing. Another technique is to fill a bucket full of water and just kind of rinse the plant around in the bucket until all the soil falls off, and it'll be a lot easier to see what you're dealing with, and you can then separate it much more easily. So once you've taken off as much as you can using the rinsing method and just gently taking away the soil, it should hopefully fall apart into a nice little separate sections. If it doesn't, like the one I have here has, because basically I had this grown in a pot last year and the roots are quite congested, so there's really solid mass of roots at the moment. If it was grown in the open soil for longer, probably be easier to separate. So what I'm going to do now, there's a couple of options. The least invasive option is to try and tease it apart by hand, see if it will pull apart. If it doesn't pull apart by hand, then you have to go into a bit more invasive method, or maybe using a spade to cut it in half. Ideally you don't cut things in half if they have bulbs, because the bulbs will be damaged. It's fine if it's more like a root system, just like a normal herbaceous plant, but if it's got tubers or bulbs, ideally you don't go in and cut it with a spade, but sometimes that can be a last resort that you might need to do if they are really well stuck together. So this Antidesia is an example of a corm which doesn't tend to naturally divide. So what I've done here is a broken off section. So you can see here there's little sections of the corm, and I've got some roots attached, and these should grow. So I'll put these in the ground and these will grow new roots, new shoots, and these will become young plants next year. But I'll also show you a group of perennial plants which have loose forming bulbs and they're much easier to separate. This is probably the most difficult type, where you have to break off individual bulbules and they're quite difficult to separate, and the main plant remains in one large lump. But I'll show you now some Crocosmia. That's a much more easy example of a bulbous perennial which forms much looser bulbs and you can easily separate. So I use this as an example of a bulbous perennial plant which is much easier to separate and much more usual for bulbous perennials. So this is a Crocosmia. It's got nice orange flowers in the summer. There's also a nice red variety. Now this one has quite small bulbules and they do tend to stick together, but they're very easy to separate, and quite often they'll separate naturally themselves. So I'll dig up a clump now and show you how much more easier this is to separate than Antidesia, and this is much more in keeping with most bulb forming and rhizome forming perennials. So as you can see, this is the plant now dug up. You've got separate little bulbs. You can just kind of tease them apart, pull them apart from the main plant. Again, this is best done when the plant is dormant. It's late winter now, but we've had some mild weather, so this has started to sprout and grow again. So these can just be separated and then planted up individually. Now sometimes the bulbs kind of stack on top of each other. You can see here, for example, we've got some bulbs which are still stuck together. With an easily separated clump like this, I could just plant this as a whole plant. But if I wanted more plants, or if I had a plant which was somewhere between the Antidesia and this one, where they're not separating quite as easy, you can just kind of pull them apart like that, snap them, make them separate. That will become one new plant, and this one as well will be planted as a new one. And in fact, this one can be separated further into more small bulbs. There's actually 3 here in total. So you can see there, you can actually make 3 small bulbs out of that. So with most bulbous perennials, it should be easy like this. If it's like this Antidesia and it's still growing on one tuber, what you have to do is break off separate sections with a little bit of rhizome attached and a little bit of root and shoot, and then you can grow that on. So I'll go ahead now, pot these up and show you the differences between the two. So when it comes to the planting up of these plants, it's fairly similar, but there are some slight differences. If you've got a truly separated bulbous perennial, it doesn't matter too much about the orientation, but ideally you do want to have it facing in the correct direction. So you should be able to tell where the roots are roughly, or where there's a shoot coming out the top, and you just want to bury that probably about twice its depth underground. Just make sure it's well nestled in, and that's pretty much all you need to do. As I say, orientation isn't too important with a lot of bulbs. If they're the wrong way up, it will probably sort itself out, but ideally you do want to plant them the correct way around. Now when it comes to separated tubers which you have to break off pieces, these are much more important that they're planted the right direction. And in fact with this one you can actually see there's going to be a new one next year growing from this point here. So these will keep growing new sections. But it's important that you've got enough rhizome. The more rhizome you can take off, the better. But it can be difficult with some of these plants if it's just one rhizome and you're breaking them in separate pieces. And you should be able to remember or tell where the top half was. So this one, for example, is this section here. This is where the shoots were. That's the rhizome at the bottom. And that wound there is where it was originally broken off from the plant. So I want to plant it this way up. And I want to make sure this is all buried by soil. And in fact, this section here, although it's the leaves, that was actually also underground, and you can tell that because it's still white. There's no chlorophyll in there. If it had experienced daylight and it was above soil, that would normally be green. So again, I want to plant that in the pot, so I just need to make sure it's the correct depth. But ideally you'd probably want a slightly larger pot than this one here, and then you just want to fill it around with the soil. And then if you're doing this in winter, you want to keep it somewhere cold and but away from the hardest of frost. When it's in the pot, it's not going to be quite as hardy as usual. And then you want to slowly increase the temperatures over time. When it comes to springtime, put it somewhere sheltered, allow it to grow a little, and once you've got a small young plant establishing, then it'll be ready to plant out. So this is a good way of dividing plants, and especially with plants like the Crocosmia, over several years they get too congested. They need to be separated to grow at their best, so it's a good way to separate them and give them a bit more space to grow.